gin and sulfur mustard chemical weapons were released in and around Ypres. In fact, sulfur mustard was first called Yperite, as it was released near Ypres in July 1917. The use of these weapons to injure, incapacitate, and kill were immediate and devastating, killing and maiming combatants and civilians alike. If the wind blew erratically, the villages that lay in the path of the grey-green cloud suffered the same fate as soldiers in the trenches. Gas warfare between 1915 and 1918 inflicted more than 1 million casualties and killed over 90,000 people. At least 250,000 of the casualties caused by poison gas were civilians. And the destructive effects did not end with armistice day. A century later, we are still recovering thousands of shells and unexploded ordnances from the Western Front. Of the close to 200 tons of shells and ammunition recovered each year in the so-called iron harvest, about 10% are chemical weapons munitions. The destruction of these at the facilities at Porcapelle is a necessary job. That's what I was doing yesterday, visiting this facility. In the course of collecting and destroying these remnants of war, many lives have been lost, but many more would die if this were not done. We come here today to remember those terrible events, the repercussions of which shocked the world and led to the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning their use. The international community swore to remain vigilant, to never forget those horrors, to learn from them, and to ensure they never happened again. How sad it is then that a century later we still find ourselves living in the deathly shadow of weapons of mass destruction. How disappointing it is that the world remains filled with weapons that are disproportionate and indiscriminate, weapons that precipitate the mass killings of civilians, weapons that have the destructive power to end all human life. Less than 2 years ago, confirmation of the use of chemical weapons in Syria served as a shocking reminder that chemical weapons had not yet been consigned to history. Allegations of the use of chemical weapons continue. That some of these allegations involve the use of chlorine gas is a bitter irony today. In this context, the multinational effort to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons program was a momentous undertaking and an important achievement. It shows not only that the taboo against chemical weapons remains intact, but stands as an illustration of the power of international cooperation in the service of a common goal. It underlines the enduring importance and value of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the need for those few countries that still remain outside the Convention to adhere to it without further delay and achieve universal membership. It is a timely reminder for all states that have yet to do so to complete the destruction of their chemical weapons stockpiles. As the Secretary General said in the message I have just read, we cannot despair and wring our hands. We must get on with the job at hand, and we must do so by focusing on that which unites us, our common ground as humanity. There are many challenges that lie ahead, but with political will, we can overcome them. The global taboos against the possession or use of chemical and biological weapons remain strong. No state argues for their legality or for their value as an instrument of deterrence. Yet, the threat of a non-state actor appropriating a chemical, biological, or, God forbid, a nuclear weapon is real. The daily images of the brutality these groups are capable of inflicting is gruesome enough. It does not bear thinking of what they would do should they obtain a genuine weapon of mass destruction. The United Nations has, over many decades, developed a set of 5 multilateral principles to guide the process of disarmament. These include transparency, verification, irreversibility, universality, and bindingness. The experience of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the chemical disarmament operations in Syria strongly reaffirmed these specific principles. Achieving universal membership in the biological and chemical weapons conventions and the elimination of all types of weapons of mass destruction would go far towards satisfying some of our most revered tenets of international humanitarian law, especially the prohibition against the indiscriminate targeting of civilians. As regards the third category of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, and despite clear evidence of the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons, there remain some 16,000 of them in arsenals around the globe, many on high alert status. These weapons and the chimera of deterrence remain central to the security doctrines of those who hold them, as demonstrated by their expensive plans to modernize and update their arsenals, plans which envisage retaining nuclear weapons for many decades to come. The gap is widening between those who believe the abolition of nuclear weapons is a challenge to be overcome at some undetermined time and only when conditions are right, and those who believe they must be eliminated as soon as possible, preferably within a specified time frame. This latter group represents the vast majority of NPT parties. They do not view the action plan as open-ended, and they demand demonstrated proof that nuclear weapon states are acting to fulfill their obligations under Article 6 of the treaty. This will be the key debate at the 2015 review conference of the parties to the treaty on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, the NPT, which starts, as you know, on Monday, as they review the implementation of the 64-point action plan agreed at the 2010 review conference. This year, 2015, also marks the 70th anniversary of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the first and thankfully only use of nuclear weapons. It serves as a sobering reminder of the devastating human consequences of nuclear weapons and of the urgent need to rid them from the world. In light of this imperative, the emergence over the last 5 years of a humanitarian approach to nuclear disarmament has provided a gathering momentum and injected fresh energy into a frozen debate. This movement seeks to underscore the devastating human impact of nuclear weapons, ground them in international humanitarian law, and place the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons at the forefront of all nuclear disarmament negotiations. We cannot wait for the catastrophic consequences from the use of nuclear weapons, intentional or by accidental or unauthorized means, to realize this. This initiative has sought new solutions to the seemingly intractable problem of nuclear weapons and created new constituencies for nuclear disarmament, uniting medical practitioners, climate scientists, and relief workers with the peace and security community. Some 155 states supported New Zealand's statement on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in the General Assembly's First Committee last November. This number represents almost 80% of the UN member states. It cannot be ignored. 100 years after the first use of weapons of mass destruction, it is time to say enough. As we gather here today to remember those terrible events of 100 years ago and the countless men and women killed and maimed, we also remember those that continue to be victims to the tools of violence used in the First World War. Let us, as the Secretary General urged, take up our shared responsibility to pursue a universal ban on the possession and use of all weapons of mass destruction. Let us work to find our common ground on behalf of those who have perished and to ensure those generations yet to come do not have to endure the same fate. Thank you. And now it is my pleasure pleasure to start chairing this morning session. I wonder if some of the speakers would like to sit up here with me. As I call the names, I will sit here and then they can also sit here after they talk. The first speaker we have today, and we're very honored to have him, is Jean-Pascal Sanders. The title of his presentation is A Century of Chemical Weapons. Dr. Jean-Pascal Sanders from Belgium is an independent researcher consultant on disarmament and security questions. He heads The Trench, a research initiative dedicated to the future of disarmament. He holds master's degrees in Germanic philology, linguistics, and political sciences, and a PhD in political sciences from the Free University of Brussels. He was project leader of the Chemical and Biological Warfare Project at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, director of the Geneva-based Bioweapons Prevention Project, and senior research fellow at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. He has participated as an expert to the EU delegations in the BTWC and CWC meetings since 2010. He is currently running a project on the longer-term future of the chemical and biological and toxin weapons conventions and researches CWPW disarmament in the Middle East. Mrs. Sanders, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for this introduction. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here on this very special occasion. And it's really an honor for me to be able to address you at this particular anniversary here. I notice in the audience many people from Iraq, from Iran, Kurds, people who have all actually witnessed chemical warfare, the horrors of chemical warfare in my lifetime. Actually, in the middle of the 1980s, when more and more reports were coming in of chemical attacks in Iraq against the Kurds, against the Iranians, you know, Sardasht, Penjwin, Halabja. These are the things that really brought me into the field of chemical disarmament. And today, I'm proud to still be here. Anyway, what I would like to do in my presentation is to give a reflection. I've added the subtitle, While Disarmament Prevailed Over Armament. And I would like to go, we've been talking about the Chemical Weapons Convention today in force quite a few times over the past days. But what were the factors that actually led to chemical warfare in the trenches in 1915? And what were then the factors that actually led to the international community choosing to abandon those weapons eventually? Well, let's first have a look. The chemical weapons attack, the chlorine attack on the 22nd of April 100 years ago just did not happen out of the blue. There were many trends that were developing already since the end of the 18th century, strengthened or multiplied during the 19th century, and it really then took the First World War, the stagnation on the front, lack of movement, to bring the various elements together. One factor is, of course, the emergence of chemistry as a science. Before, it was like mostly alchemy. People had certain ideas, they were still trying to turn lead into gold, and so forth. But the development of the scientific method was absolutely critical in that. Part of that process in the 19th century was that the concept of poison was moving away from a substance that occurred naturally in nature, be it mineral, be it from the animals or from plants, but something that became developed, synthesized in laboratories, produced on industrial scale towards the 19th century. And it's really interesting, Virginia in her introduction mentioned the three major chemical warfare agents that were introduced in the Ypres salient area during the First World War: chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas. Well, chlorine was isolated in its pure form towards the end of the 18th century. Phosgene, which was the prime killer agent during the First World War, was first synthesized in 1812. A mustard agent, well, the compound of a mustard agent was described in the scientific literature in papers published in 1860, 1861. So what we had were all the ingredients for chemical warfare, only what the people didn't do at the time was actually connect those particular compounds to methods of warfare. The other elements that were required was industrialization, large-scale production capacities that could be mobilized eventually to sustain chemical warfare. There was the need for education. People need to have understanding. But most and foremost, what education does is to bring to the people, to us all in our schools, the ability to identify a problem, analyze a problem, find a solution to the problem, and apply that solution to solve it. That's called technology. That type of understanding that there are technical solutions to human problems was very critical to the development of that type of warfare. And what the First World War then did was basically the industrialization of war. All resources were being mobilized: the home front, people, agriculture, the economy, industry, everything was mobilized with the sole purpose of sustaining the war fighting capacity of a particular state. And this is ultimately what forced the integration of science, industry, and military art. In the case of chemical warfare, stagnation on the front. Fritz Haber had the idea of applying toxic chemicals to restore mobility to the front. He brought the various elements together. His ideas were executed 100 years ago. Another aspect to bear in mind is how the First World War was quite different from previous war. In a certain way, we could say it was the first three-dimensional war. Most of the wars before were on land or on sea. However, in the First World War, it also took to the air: airplanes, zeppelins, and balloons. But it also went below the surface of the seas with the submarines and mines. Many of these elements also existed before, but the First World War brought them all together. Now, the trenches, many of which are still around here in the area which you can visit, these are kind of passages in the ground. The dugouts are in the ground. It's also three-dimensional. They offer protection on a stagnated front where otherwise the people would have been exposed to the bullets and the shells. And even that led to offensive warfare, because there was tunneling and counter-tunneling going on, and also the scars of that you can still see in the area. Messin, right here, when the Brits detonated a huge underground mine under the German lines as part of the warfare operations. And again, it was a development in warfare where gas fit in very well. If the soldiers had protections by digging into the ground like rodents at the time, well, the gases used in warfare are heavier than air. They sink in every little hole that you can find in the ground. In other words, the trenches no longer offered protection. The dugouts became targets for them. It was, in another way, a typical outcome of the developments during the First World War. Now, an interesting aspect of coming to the idea of banning first the use of chemical weapons, later to abandon, is to have an understanding of how attitudes were towards gas warfare. And it's a complex story, I can only give you the big outlines. But in general, the people living along the Western Front, the people coming from the principal countries, Belgium, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Great Britain, they resented gas, like they resent poison. Because, you know, once you're exposed to it, you cannot escape the consequences of poisoning. And particularly gas is stealthy. Later with mustard gas, if you read many of the stories where it lingers in the ground, and the soldiers, they were kind of crawling across the terrain, then with their hands they would rub the sweat out of their eyes and they would actually expose themselves to mustard gas poisoning as a consequence. It was omnipresent at a way. However, and that's really interesting, from their perspective, gas did not really stand out as something particularly atrocious, not in the way as we perceive it today. Because sitting in the trenches, they were living in very bad conditions. It was raining, there was mud, there were the rodents, the stench of dead bodies that, you know, after a bombardment, parts would come up. They had sleep deprivation. They suffered disease and hunger, thirst. And then there were the snipers and the artillery. Gas was just one of those elements in it. And particularly in 1918, when chemical warfare became omnipresent, gas was just everywhere all the time. And we see the stories, the testimonials of soldiers in the frontline trenches wearing gas masks 48 hours and longer, without taking off, just changing the filters after certain times. Now, just imagine, in those days, today gas masks have possibilities to drink and take nourishment. If you took off your gas mask, you exposed yourself to the poison elements. So extreme gas discipline started developing over the years in ways that taught soldiers to survive, not to be afraid from the gas. That was the essential element of the training they were getting. But in the end, every single soldier in 1918, to one extent or another, was poisoned. There was no way of escaping it. So these people kind of accepted gas as something you just had to endure, something that you, at least you were being drilled to survive, to have hope for another day. Attitudes were different in the countries that were not involved in the war, or where the societies were farther removed from. And if we take Canada and the United States, for example, where the population was like an ocean separated from the battlefields, what you had was that the soldiers who were exposed, particularly with the mustard gas, they could not return to combat and they were sent home. These soldiers, they would, after having recovered, walk in the streets, go around. They would be coughing terribly all the time. They would have wheezing, breathing, and so forth. It's something you could not have. To the people in Canada and the United States, that became the symbol of the horror of war. It kind of encapsulated the totality, all the experiences that the people were having on the front. Everything was projected in that symbol of coughing and so on. In the Netherlands, a neutral country during the World War, they also had a strong moral revulsion against the slaughter in the trenches. And note, it was against the slaughter in the trenches. Their opposition was against war as such, not necessarily chemical warfare. Many Belgians escaped to the Netherlands. They brought the stories from the front lines, the first-hand experiences of the horrors of war. So the images were kind of reinforced among the people there. And it's really interesting that some of the big peace movements that we still know today, like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, had their origins in the Netherlands. The same goes with the War Resisters International, that has as a symbol the broken rifle. These organizations initially were not particularly against chemical warfare. Their actions, their energies were against war. And this is one of the reasons why during the war and after the war, there's something of a time lag between the mobilization of public opinion against chemical warfare, with the exception of Canada and the United States. If we think of that, and we think of today what's happening in Syria, and we see how the various factions combating the regime in Syria were not really interested in the removal, the disarmament of chemical weapons. They really had to be convinced of that. Whereas in Europe, North America, Asia, Australia, and so on, the people really mobilized to uphold the norm against chemical weapons. That difference in attitude, I'm wondering whether we're not seeing a modern-day version of certain experiences that occurred, that developed during and after the First World War. And it's really interesting in the debates on how to go about the future of disarmament. But let's get back to the 1920s, the early 1920s. And it was clearly something had to happen. But the trend immediately after the war was not to constrain chemical weapons, rather it was to assist other countries to acquire chemical weapons. Because one of the lessons that the people had drawn from the First World War was really, well, if you are a lesser developed country, particularly in the field of chemistry and its industrial applications, then you would be at a serious disadvantage. So the idea of non-discrimination in security relationships was reflected in allowing countries to acquire certain weapon capacities. Because it was not the number of countries possessing chemical weapons that was problematic at the time, it was the fact that one country would have an exclusive capacity and another one not. That was perceived to be a factor that would contribute to outbreak of future war. So countries were being assisted, including Belgium, which is a story that's not really well known, but Belgium had an offensive chemical weapons program in the 1930s, and it ended with the Second World War. At the same time, but on the other hand, we had the League of Nations that had come into being, and in a variety of committees, chemical weapon issues, biological weapons, bacteriological weapons were already popping up in discussions. But in 1925, in May, there was a special conference that wanted to ban the arms trade at the time. That was an idea. And on the first day, the US delegate, he submitted a proposal to ban the trade in implements of chemical warfare, which was a good idea, which fit kind of in the mandate of that particular conference. The only problem was, how would you justify banning the sale of chemical weapons if there's no prohibition on chemical weapons, if there's no prohibition on chemical warfare? That issue they were unable to resolve. But as it had been raised as part of their deliberations, the people in that particular meeting, they decided that they had to come up with a declaration that the use of chemical weapons in war was to be prohibited. That became the Geneva Protocol. Idea was raised early in May 1925, the 25th of June 1925, the document was there, and it entered into force in 1928. The very striking thing during those discussions is that the diplomats discovered what today we know as dual use. That is, a particular technology can be applied for military purposes and it can be applied for civilian purposes. And of course, one of the reasons why I've given you the history of the various trends that contributed to the emergence of chemical warfare in the First World War was to show you that a number of developments, a number of things that were routine in the industry, in civilian society, could be used for military purposes under different types of circumstances. So how do you ban something which has everyday legitimate purposes, and then the next day you use it as a weapon of war? And what happened during the deliberations, here are a couple of extracts, of course. It's basically, they noted the fact, they discovered it, and they were unsure how to deal with it. Again, it was one of the reasons why the ban in the trade was impossible, and they went for the Geneva Protocol. Banning the trade, bear in mind, was also something that was not really palatable to the powers at the time, again for that principle of non-discrimination. The states, if there was a trade ban on those toxic chemicals, on the weapons, then of course countries with a limited chemical industry would be denied the capacity to have a chemical weapons capacity. So that was really the mindset. It's the opposite of NPT and so on that we have today. But the principle of non-discrimination played big in those days. Well, over the next couple of years, the late 1920s and the very early 1930s, actually the various committees in the League of Nations came up with solutions. And they had three critical issues to resolve here. One thing they started realizing, if you want to prevent chemical warfare, thus to make the Geneva Protocol effective, you had to ban preparations for chemical warfare in peacetime. That was a key condition. That, of course, that realization forced the diplomats to take the dual-use problem head on. They could not issue it. In May 1932, a report from the Special Commission on Chemical and Biological Weapons offered a number of solutions, and those solutions, taken together, were, you know, the seeds of what we know today as the general purpose criterion. First element, definition of a chemical weapon. You must absolutely define what you are going to control. And they went through various rounds. They rejected a definition, a circumscription on the basis of toxicity and lethality. They also rejected a categorization based on the chemical composition of the agents. What they had to do was capture all toxic chemicals, including tear gas. That was a very important issue in the considerations there. They had to capture all toxic chemicals, the ones that existed at the time, but remember the trends. They also realized that developments were going to take place in the future, and they had to capture those toxic chemicals too. So that led to a definition with a focus on the physiological impact of the chemical warfare agents, the way it works on the body of living organisms. And secondly, very important, the emphasis was on all toxic chemicals. In other words, there would be no exception to the definition of a chemical weapon. Irrespective of what type of toxic chemical weapon, if it had a physiological impact on the living organism, it was part of the definition. The second aspect that happened was they were not going to discuss whether certain chemicals were peaceful or certain chemicals were warlike. It was impossible to differentiate. So what they decided, and that was the second key important key element for the general purpose criterion to emerge, the prohibition on the use of toxic chemicals was going to be the default position. That was going to be the foundation. You could do nothing with toxic chemical weapons, be it in the industry, be it everywhere, unless it was for a purpose that had been specifically identified as being legitimate. In other words, the ban is the default, and then through the negotiations, the diplomats identified a number of applications that would be authorized. That has a major impact, because then you don't have to verify volumes of chemicals and so forth. What you have to do is start to verify the applications to which you're using them. And that's a totally different concept of verification for later on. The third element they had to do, they realized in the First World War, defense and protection had taken a slight edge over offense. Meaning that if we wanted to prevent chemical weapons from being used at any time, avoiding that somebody would get a strategically relevant breakout capacity, defense and production had to be organized, had to be authorized. Countries had to be allowed to defend themselves against attack. And in 1933, Great Britain submits to the League of Nations a draft convention. It was a comprehensive disarmament treaty. Chemical, biological weapons were one part of it. And in Article 52, we see the elements of what we know today as the general purpose criterion. The words are highlighted in red. So you can see, for example, under 1, the second paragraph, the quantities of chemical substances necessary for protective experiments, therapeutic research, and laboratory work shall be accepted. The exception is what allows something to happen. The ban is the default. Below, you see that manufacture, import, export, or be in the possession of appliances or substances suitable for both peaceful and military purpose with the intent to use them in the violation of the prohibition contained in Article 48, which is the ban on the use of chemical weapons, is the core element. The purposes is very clearly defined. And the third paragraph also then speaks about the training, the defense, the protection against it, for the purposes within jurisdiction. And each time the purposes are identified. And the same is in Article 2 of the Chemical Weapons Convention, where you have the blanket prohibition, and then you have a list of activities which are explicitly non-prohibited. Chemical Weapons Convention is good in all negatives and double negatives. So, what is the lasting impact of the Geneva Protocol? Well, because of the way they have approached the problem, they actually led the foundation for disarmament, the total elimination of the weapon category, rather than dealing with arms control, where states still have the right to residual capacities. So arms control, if you reduce nuclear weapons, still some weapons remain. In the chemical, the biological area, it's zero. Nothing is tolerated. That makes it very easy for verification, because you don't have to count what exists. By definition, nothing can exist. It changes, it makes the whole general purpose criterion operational. No use of the Geneva Protocol. If you look at the text, it's like 1 page long, and people complain that it's not very strong, it has been violated, and so on. However, it pushed chemical biological weapons to the margins of military doctrine. One of the effects, if you look at the details of discussions in governments, one of the things that you could see is, for example, a situation where somebody in the government, representative of the military or whatever, would say, okay, we would like to have so much money in the budget for the acquisition of chemical weapons. The guy sitting in the Ministry of the Budget or Finance would say, okay, but why would I want to give you money to invest in a weapon of which you say in advance that you're never going to use it? And these types of arguments were the elements that started contributing to pushing chemical, biological weapons to the margins of military doctrine, at least in the political decision-making. And important, also from the nuclear perspective, very often you hear that, in my mind, a kind of oxymoron, but, nuclear weapons cannot be uninvented. True. Chemical weapons can't be uninvented. I mean, the same substances phosgene we still use in the industry today. Chlorine is being produced, annually, 56 million tons. Think when the attack happened 100 years ago, we were talking about 160 tons. Now, as part of a legitimate trade globally, we're talking about 56 million. But what did happen was that the military started forgetting how to use them effectively. In other words, the burden to use them started increasing, the incentive to use them started decreasing all the time. That was a very important aspect. The technology is not forgotten, but the way to use them effectively is. And if we think, just to think of the future topics that will be discussed over the next 2 days, if you think of nuclear weapon disarmament and the role of a general purpose criterion. Now, we've just had the whole discussion about this agreement with Iran on nuclear enrichment. And, you know, they have 6,000 plus centrifuges, and if you have 6,000 plus one, that would be a violation. Okay, to somebody having worked in the chemical biological area, what's the sense of that? Because the agreement, the framework agreement as we have it, and then the detailed agreement, is that one then going to apply to Israel? Is it going to apply to North Korea? Well, no, you will have to renegotiate everything. In a disarmament context with a general purpose criterion, it's the same standard for everybody. And that's key criterion. It's non-discriminatory. The very foundation which Virginia has mentioned in her opening statement of disarmament is already embedded in the concept of the general purpose criterion. So, the second aspect is you would not have to haggle every time of what is peaceful and what is not peaceful. To put it basically is, if I were to apply what emerged in the 1960s to enrichment in Iran, well, the situation would be all enrichment is prohibited. But it wouldn't be all prohibited just for Iran, it would be all prohibited for every country in the world. And then you would have certain types of nuclear-related activities that would be identified as being authorized, and those activities would then be verified. But everybody would have same obligations and same rights to use. But, and this is the key element to work, and this, in my mind, is lacking in the nuclear debate. You have to have that ban on use. If there is no formal ban on use on nuclear weapons, you're not going to get anywhere. You need to have that foundation to build everything else on. And people are going to say, well, there are the no-use declarations. It's not the same, because that actually confirms the exceptionality of 5 countries and some other countries. They make a unilateral pledge. It's not a multilateral global norm you create. They make a unilateral pledge not to do something under certain circumstances. And it's up to them whether they will honor it or not under the circumstances. That goes back to all declarations banning the use of poison, you know, in centuries ago that have existed. So this is a key element to do. And actually, for the people interested in nuclear disarmament, somehow, perhaps I'm naive, but sometimes it's good to be naive, otherwise you don't have ideas. But somehow I feel if you were to persuade a couple of countries to get together, write out a one-page document, and then with that one-page document, go to all the states that are already a member of a zone free of nuclear weapons. Go to many European states, North American states that have renounced nuclear weapons. Within a very short time, the number of signatories to that, should we call it the Protocol of Ypres, would be larger than the membership of the Geneva Protocol today. If you just think of it, and how powerful such a statement would be, quite simple to organize. But perhaps I am naive, and happily so. But bear in mind, the Geneva Protocol on the 25th of June is going to celebrate its 90th anniversary. And it's still effective, it's still the foundation of a lot of international law, and it's the foundation of the UN Secretary General's mechanism to investigate, because it's that document that gives him the authority to investigate what's happening in Syria, possibly in Iraq in the future. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, you can sit down. Thank you very much, Jean-Paul. It was really very, very clear. And thank you for taking less time than was allotted to you, which means that we do have about 5 minutes for any 1 or 2 questions or answers you would like to pose, or any clarification you would like on his presentation. So I will open the floor, but really not more than 5 minutes. So I will take 1 or 2 interventions. Anybody wishes to pose a question to Mrs. Sanders? issues like, yes?
You talked about the progression in the interwar period of chemical weapons, which was an evolution of a tactical weapon into a strategic role. Whereas nuclear weapons, in some cases, in some defense policies, have moved from a strategic weapon to a tactical weapon, in their doctrine at least. I mean, to a certain degree, they're all strategic. But how do you see that fitting into some of what we discussed?
Just a minute. A last comment that he can answer. Yes, last one. Yes.
Why were chemicals not used in World War II?
Very good. Then I will stop it there, and you will agree. Would you like to come here or there?
Okay, thank you very much for both questions. In the first one, one must always bear in mind that chemical weapons were always kind of essentially tactical weapons to be used on the battlefield. It's one of the reasons why I will never use the weapon of mass destruction, because in very many cases the tactics, the main purpose, not even primarily to harm people, but to deny terrain in the way landmines, cluster munitions do, and so forth. But one thing that happened, and it already gets a bit into the second question, was when people, countries on the eve of the Second World War were clearly afraid of chemical warfare, and some countries had massive chemical defense programs going on. They were making a number of statements of deterrence on a strategic level, and particularly Churchill made statements that if the Germans were ever to use chemical weapons, there would be massive retaliation against the German cities. But the statement in itself is already very indicative of the state of chemical warfare, because it was a kind of realization that they didn't have the capacity to actually fight on the battlefield. They had certain preparations, but nothing to wage chemical warfare on the scale of the First World War. So they put it on a strategic level with, the concept of total war having developed. Civilian populations were a legitimate target. But that was very much the rhetoric at the time, and to the best of my knowledge, no country had the capacity to wage large-scale chemical warfare on the eve of the Second World War. In addition to that, in reply to the second question, it was also much more a war of movement going on. There was no stagnation. It's also really interesting to study, for example, when the front started moving again in the late summer of 1918, that most of the weapons developed for gas warfare in the trenches were quite unsuitable to deploy to support the offensive operations. And that also was part of the problem. Then again, there was the norm against it, which was now very explicit. And while there are many indications that chemical weapons were behind the troops, think of the accident in the port of Bari in Italy in 1943, when the ship was bombed and it was filled with mustard gas. So, it was a terrible accident. And because of the secrecy, nobody said it was mustard gas. But it was not there to be used on a very large scale. It was like a latent deterrence, something not to use, just to be clear, not to be caught, to wake up, and to be caught unprepared. That was the kind of preparation essential. The one exception, of course, was Japan's use in China in the 1930s and early 1940s. But again, President Roosevelt, even though not being party to the protocol, made a very clear statement based on the principle of the protocol.
I think we can thank our speaker for his clarity. Thank you again very much. And now I think we're going to do a small session on testimonials, which are probably the most poignant way we have to not just recall, but empathize and show solidarity, understand what people go through that must go through this horrific experience. So we're very lucky to have two survivors of a chemical attack, Simnako Mohammed Ahmed and Hassani Sadi. They would like to witness their experience with this terrible weapon and respectively as it panned out in Iraq and Iran. Simnako Mohammed Ahmed is a survivor of the gas attack in Halabja in March 16, 1998. He was a baby at the time. His father, sister, and 4 brothers were all killed in the attack. He was separated from his mother and displaced in Iran for 20 years. He now lives reunited with his mother and family in Sulaymaniyah, Iraq. He is an undergraduate student at the American University of Iraq. And I'll also introduce Hassan Hassani Sadi, who is a survivor of the gas attack from Iran, and he is today a volunteer member of the Tehran Peace Museum. So if I could please have the honor of having Simnako Mohammed Ahmed come up to the podium. Thank you.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's an honor for me to be here among you, and I want to thank you that invite us and give us that opportunity to share our history with you. Today we all gather here to commemorate the 100th anniversary of usage of chemical weapons. And let me start to give you an overview of what happened in our region. The genocide event in our region started by destroying villages. The Iraqi government started destroying villages and forced the people in the village to go to the big city. And the reason was that our patriotic soldiers, Peshmerga, they were in the mountain, and in the night they came down to the villages and they get food. And the Iraqi regime decided to destroy all the villages and force the people inside the village to go to the bigger cities. So our family were also in one of those villages, and they destroyed our village and forced us to go to Halabja. And we have in March 16, in the day of the chemical bombardment of Halabja, the aircraft came to on the air of our city. They threw some piece of paper to find out the direction of the wind, and then after that they start bombing our city with chemical weapons. You may ask this question that I'm young, and how can I be a survivor of chemical bombardment that happened in 1988. I was 3 months old during that time. And when the chemical bombardment happened, the Iranian soldiers came to our city. They took me to a city close to Afghanistan border, Mashhad. And I was adopted there by an Iranian family. I lost my entire family in Halabja, and when I got to Mashhad and I was adopted by Iranian family, I didn't know who my real parents are. So I lived with my Iranian family for about 17 years, and when I was 17, one of the most unfortunate events of my life happened, and I lost my only person in my life, my Iranian mother. And then one question always came to my mind, that I always asked God, why should I lose 2 families? I lost one family in Halabja, and I was adopted by an Iranian family. Then I lost my Iranian mother. She was a widow when she adopted me, so I was alone. And then one of the other problems that I had in Iran was that I didn't have nationality. I was stateless, and I didn't have Iranian nor Iraqi nationality. I went to many organizations to get a nationality, at least Iraqi or Irani. I want to have a nationality. But unfortunately, I didn't get any response from any of those organizations, except one organization, the Peace Museum of Tehran. I sent them an email, and one day I received a reply from Dr. Khatiri, who is present here. And I received the reply. He said that I have connection with Halabja, and I can help you to come back there. And then that was the key to solve all of my problems. I have to thank him. I owe my new life to him. And then, through his connection, I met some of the authority in Kurdistan. And I tried to come back to Kurdistan. When I get to Halabja, to my city, for the first time in my life, there were about 65 families who lost their children. Some of them knew that their children are alive, but they just lost them. So among those 65 families, there were about 5 families whose child's age during the attack was close to mine. So the only way to realize that who is my real family was a DNA test. So a DNA test was taken, and it took about 1 month to get the result. And in a big ceremony with the president of all the 5 families, who really thought that I am their child. Each of the family thought that I am their child, and they had a hope that I can come to their family again. And in that ceremony, they read the name of my real family, and I found my real mother. After 22 years. It was a very special moment when I met my mother for the first time, my real mother. I didn't know Kurdish. I couldn't speak with her. She didn't know Persian. So the only way to communicate was through our eyes. And then she told me that, unfortunately, I have lost my father, 4 of my brothers, and my sister during the attack. This is my side of the story. And if you look at the story from my mother's side, she was in the attack during that time, and they tried to escape the city. But unfortunately, one of the bombs were close to our house. And then when they came back to the house, my mother was not conscious. And then when she opened her eyes, she was in a hospital in Iran, and she didn't have any idea about what has happened to her family. My story is a drop of water in an ocean. We have many other special stories in our city. One of the other survivors is present here, Mr. Hikmat. He was a Peshmerga during that time. He was living in the mountains. And during the attack, he lost 11 members of his family. And it took about 6 months until he realized that he has lost his family. What I want to say is that no matter where, how, and against whom those actions happen, the consequences are the same. I want to tell the world that I have lost my family, and they will never come back to my life. But what I am worried about is the future of my family. I don't want anyone in the world to have the same feeling that I have today. I have lost them. They will not come back to my life. But the only thing that I am concerned about is the future of my family. I don't want them to suffer the same way that I suffer. I think Hikmat will agree with me. And also, the danger is not just for me, it's for you also. It may happen to you as well. I was the youngest survivor of chemical weapon some years ago, but unfortunately those weapons were used again in Syria. And we can say new generation of survivors exist now in Syria. And the international community keeps silent about it. About 1,300 people died in Syria because of the chemical weapons. And now international community has not helped them. And no doctor has been sent to help them. And I think it's a time to take some action. We have to stop pointing at each other and blaming each other. All of us know that Iraqi or Syrian government, they are not able to create those weapons. So we know that the Western countries are helping them. We are not blaming anyone, and we are not waiting for apology. But I think we can stop it. And the first step to do that is to recognize Halabja as a genocide. Unfortunately, until now, it has not been recognized as a genocide. And then we have to stop providing those chemicals to those government that may misuse it. And I think another step is to help those people who are affected by those chemicals for the treatment. Because we are losing our people, those who are affected by the chemical every day in our city. And this is an unfortunate thing. I think it would be great if we can help them for treatment. And these are like stars that lighten our city, and we are losing them every day. I just want to mention something. I told you that we were in a village. Now I am married. I am studying in the American university, in the best university in Iraq. But I prefer to live in my village with my family. I prefer having my brother around me, not having this life, but having my brother around me. This may happen to anyone in the world. So it's better to think about it, take an action, and start it. Thank you very much.
Appreciate your words. Can I introduce Hassan Hassani Saadi? Hassan Hassani Saadi was an 18-year-old fighter in the 8-year Iran-Iraq war when he survived the Iraqi chemical attack on the Fao Peninsula in 1985. He has spent many years speaking about the suffering he continues to go through as a result of the mustard gas to which he was exposed to. He has fought to raise awareness of the horrifying consequences of uses of chemical weapons in order to ensure that such attacks do not happen again. So if I could have Hassan Hassani Saadi, please.
خانم و آقایان، ایمانان محترم، دوستان، صبح بخیر. من حسن حسنی سعدی هستم و امروز به نمایندگی از موزه صلح تهران در ایران اینجا هستم. این افتخار بزرگی است برای من که در چنین سالگرد مهمی به ایپر دعوت شدم تا در خصوص تجربه شخصی خود در مواجهه با سلاح‌های شیمیایی صحبت کنم. من 49 سال پیش در شهر کرمان در جنوب ایران متولد شدم. هنگامی که دولت عراق در سال 1359 به ایران حمله کرد، اکثر جوانان ایرانی احساس وظیفه کردند و به دفاع از کشور خود برخاستند. همانند دیگر جوانان میهندوست میخواستم از کشورم دفاع کنم. به همین جهت در سال 1362 به صورت داوطلبانه به جبهه اعزام شدم.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, friends, good morning. My name is Hassan Hassani Sadi. I'm here today to represent the Tehran Peace Museum in Iran. It's a great honor for me to be invited to Ypres on such an important anniversary to speak about my own experience in being exposed to chemical weapons. In my message today, I would like to talk about 2 points. Firstly, I would like to briefly share with you how I became exposed to sulfur mustard gas and the consequences I and others like me have had to suffer. And secondly, I would like to talk about the role of survivors who use ourselves as living examples to raise awareness about the prohibition of chemical weapons. I was born 49 years ago in Kerman in southern Iran. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, most young Iranian men felt it was their duty to defend their country. Like most patriotic young men, I too wanted to defend my country. And in 1984, I joined up as a volunteer soldier.
در سال 1364 به عنوان غواص یک واحد شناسایی در جزیره آبادان در نزدیکی خلیج فارس مستقر شدم و در 21 بهمن ماه همان سال در عملیات نظامی فاو شرکت داشتم. 3 روز پس از آن عملیات، یعنی در 24 بهمن ماه 1364 ساعت 8 صبح، در حال استراحت در ساحل شرقی اروندرود و درست در مقابل فاو حمله شیمیایی رخ داد. هواپیماهای نظامی عراق چند بمب در منطقه انداختند. آشفتگی بسیاری بود. دود همه جا را فرا گرفته بود و مایع تیره رنگی به اطراف پاشیده میشد. متوجه شدم که حمله شیمیایی بوده. پس از آن حمله مشکل حادی نداشتم و به کار خود ادامه دادم. عواقب گاز خردل با تأخیر آشکار می شود و همین خاطر 1 ساعت بعد احساس مشکل کردم و دچار حالت تهوع شدم. حالتی وحشتناک و دردناک، احساس سوزش و خارش بسیار زیاد در پوست و چشمهایم داشتم و پس از ساعتی تاولهای تمام بدنم را پوشاند. قدرت بینایی را به طور کامل از دست دادم و تنفس به سختی انجام می شد. از آن زمان تا کنون از عوارض سلاح‌های شیمیایی رنج می‌برم. پوستم بهبود یافته، اما بینایی چشمانم خیلی کم است و همچنان به سختی تنفس می‌کنم و باید تحت درمان باشم.
By 1986, I had become a scuba diver in a reconnaissance unit and I was stationed in the Abadan Peninsula in the southern sector near the Persian Gulf. On the 10th of February of that year, I was involved in a military offensive at Faf. It was 3 days after that battle, February 13, 1986, at 8 o'clock in the morning. We were resting on the east bank of the Arman River directly across from the Faf when the chemical attack happened. Iraqi jets dropped several bombs. There was a lot of confusion. There was so much smoke and dirt fluid was splashing everywhere. We we realized it was a chemical attack. After the initial panic was over, I felt fine, so I went back to work. But mustard gas takes a while to do its damage. Within an hour, I began to realize that there was seriously wrong. I started to vomit, terrible while vomiting. My skin started to burn and my eyes felt as if they were on fire. Breathing was difficult. Since that day, I have been suffering the consequences of the chemical weapons. My skin is healed, but I continue to have very limited eyesight. I continue to have problem breathing. I need constant medical support.
در طول جنگ ایران و عراق نیروهای عراقی از 1800 تن گاز خردل استفاده کردند. بیش از 1 میلیون نفر شامل نظامیان و غیر نظامیان در معرض سلاح‌های شیمیایی قرار گرفتند. برخی از مصدومان جان خود را از دست دادند. بازماندگان نیز تحت مراقبت‌های پزشکی هستند. در حال حاضر 75,000 قربانی سلاح‌های شیمیایی در ایران همانند من همچنان تحت درمان اثرات مزمن گاز خردل هستند و این امر بخش دوم سخنان من را به ارمغان می‌آورد و نگاه به آینده.
During the Iran-Iraq war, Iraqi forces used 1,800 metric tons of sulfur mustard gas. Over 1 million people, both soldiers and civilians, were exposed to chemical weapons. Some of victims actually died from the exposure to mustard agents. The rest of us have been coping with the medical complications of mustard gas ever since the attacks. Today, 75,000 Iranian chemical weapons victims, like myself, continue to receive support for the chronic exposure to sulfur mustard gas. And this brings me to the second part of my message, looking to the future.
بعد از آن دوره خدمت من در جبهه جنگ تمام شد، احساس می‌کردم که به وظیفه خود در قبال کشورم عمل کردم. تصور می‌کردم به خوبی به کشورم خدمت کردم. فکر می‌کردم کار خوبی را انجام دادم و مسئولیت من مصدوم تمام شده است. اما اشتباه می‌کردم. من و همکارانم که بازماندگان جنگ هستیم، عهدهدار نقش مهمی می‌باشیم و با بهره‌مندی از خودمان و داستان‌های شخصیمان با آموزش جهانیان در مورد پیامدهای سلاح‌های شیمیایی می‌پردازیم.
After my part in the war was over, I felt that I had done my duty. I had served my country well. I had done my bit. My responsibilities were over, but I was wrong.
در سال 1384 به تهران آمدم و با همکاری داوطلبانه با انجمن حمایت از قربانیان سلاح‌های شیمیایی به عنوان راوی در موزه صلح تهران پرداختم. زمانی که بازدید کنندگان چهره ما را می‌بینند و صدای ما را می‌شنوند، ضرورت ممنوعیت به کارگیری سلاح‌های شیمیایی را درک می‌کنند. ما بازماندگان جنگ در موزه صلح تهران نسبت به آینده واقع‌بین هستیم. در 5 ماه گذشته 2 تن از بازماندگان داوطلب در موزه صلح تهران از دنیا رفتند. در نتیجه می‌دانیم که نوبت رفتن ما نیز فرا خواهد رسید. احساس می‌کنم که موظف هستم انسان‌ها را نسبت به عواقب سلاح‌های شیمیایی آگاه کنم و بر این باور استوار هستم.
I and my fellow survivors have a crucial role to play in using ourselves and personal stories to educate the world about what happens when chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction are used. In 2005, I moved to Tehran and I became involved with the Society for Chemical Weapons Victim Support, and I started to volunteer as a guide at the Tehran Peace Museum. When visitors look at us, listen to us, they understand why chemical weapons must be banned. At the Tehran Peace Museum, we survivors are realistic about our future. Already in the last 5 months, we have lost two of our veterans, and we know that the clock is ticking for the rest of us. We feel it is our responsibility to educate people about the atrocities of chemical weapons. We talk about how war has scared our generation, but we also share the responsibility in building peace for the future.
که هرچند جنگ نسل ما را زخمی کرد، اما نسبت به ایجاد صلح در آینده احساس تکلیف می‌کنم. موزه صلح تهران خود مرکزی برای پیشگامان صلح است که داوطلبان آن از بخش‌های مختلف جامعه در برنامه‌های موزه شرکت می‌کنند. هنرمندان ایرانی، بازیگران، فیلمسازان، ورزشکاران، دانشجویان ضمن بازدید از موزه در فعالیت‌های صلح‌آمیز موزه شرکت می‌کنند. ما میزبان پزشکانی همچون اعضای سازمان بین‌المللی پزشکان مخالف جنگ IPPNW هستیم که به آموزش در مورد پیامد سلاح‌های کشتار جمعی می‌پردازد. همچنین موزه صلح تهران و دفتر سازمان ملل متحد در ایران به منظور ارتقاء سطح آگاهی در خصوص منع سلاح‌های شیمیایی و توسعه فعالیت‌های صلح‌طلبانه فعالیت می‌کنیم.
We have started a youth awareness program called the Young Reporters. Students from Tehran secondary schools participate in reporting our chemical weapons about our chemical weapons and their consequences to their peers. They ask questions about war that young people want answered. They share their own ideas about disarmament and peace. The Tehran Peace Museum is also a hub of peace initiatives, and we have many volunteers from various sectors of society involved in our programs. Iranian artists, actors, filmmakers, athletes, and many students come to the museum to cooperate in our peace-building activities. We host doctors, for example, members of the IPPNW, who invest their time in educating against weapons of mass destruction. We are building partnership with the United Nations in Iran and with some foreign missions to help raise awareness against chemical weapons and develop peace projects.
ما با کشورهایی که پیمان سلاح‌های شیمیایی را امضا نکرده‌اند حاضر به تعامل هستیم تا مسئولیت خود را در قبال صلح جهانی بیابند و نسبت به امضای این کنوانسیون مهم اقدام کنند. به عنوان شاهدی زنده از عواقب وحشتناک جنگ شیمیایی در یک فعالیت تاریخ شفاهی دوزبانه نیز فعالیت می‌کنند. داستان واقعی زندگی ما را از طریق وبسایت موزه صلح تهران قابل شنیدن است. با احترام از شما دعوت می‌کنم که آن را بخوانید. در پایان پیام امروز خود